Welcome back, guys. I'm Dr. Chris Erskine. This is U.S. History with Top Up, and today we're going to continue talking about the 1960s, this tumultuous period in American history. So much is going on. Kennedy's elected. He's assassinated. His brother's assassinated. Martin Luther King is assassinated. Malcolm X is assassinated. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, civil rights, Vietnam, the hippie movement. We're going to talk about today the civil rights. This is a major, major moment in American history. But looking at this first slide, what I want you to do first is, or you can do it after the lesson is fine, but I want you to watch a video, and you should find this on Top Up. It should be clearly marked in this lesson, in this chapter, on your Top Up platform when you log in. I want you to watch a documentary. It's about 38 minutes long, and it's called A Time for Justice. And it's about civil rights. And because there's no way we can talk about civil rights in this class in just a few minutes. And the book, the chapter, it's a good chapter, but it doesn't have as much on civil rights as we need. And I really want you to watch civil rights, some civil rights stuff online. As part of this chapter. So watch A Time for Justice. And then for your focus question, when we talk next, I want you to be ready to, with your teacher, talk about A Time for Justice when you meet with them for your small groups or one-on-one. After the Time for Justice slide, we see a picture. In the next slide, we see a picture of Martin Luther King waving. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most famous Americans in American history. He's an incredible person. He believed that you can change government without violence. He believed that you can change things by simply not cooperating. Like Rosa Parks, she was not going to get up and give up her seat for the white man. So that was her nonviolent, non-cooperation. And Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, but here you see Martin Luther King, and he's in Washington, D.C. at a place called the Mall, and he's speaking, and a lot of people speak during this time, this civil rights, during this event. But Martin Luther King speaks, and he gives this very famous speech called I Have a Dream. He says, I have a dream that someday little black boys and little white boys and girls will be able to go to school and hold hands and be friends and love each other. And I have a dream. And Martin Luther King gives wonderful speeches. And if there's anyone that you should model your character after, there's many people, but you can look at people like Martin Luther King to model your character and behavior after good people. And Martin Luther King Jr. was one of those very good people. Look at the next slide. The 24th Amendment. Now, we talked about the 14th Amendment. We talked about the 15th Amendment, which, these two, and the 13th Amendment ended slavery, gave African Americans the right to vote, and made them citizens. Now, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment are called the Progressive Amendments. We work all the way up, and we didn't really talk so much about the other amendments. They're important, but some of the amendments are more important. Now, the 24th Amendment. 24th Amendment is ratified in 1964, and this is what this does. I'm going to read section 1 only. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president and vice president, for electors for president or vice president, and for senator or representatives in Congress shall not be denied or abridged, which means to be changed, in the United States or by any states by reason failure to pay a poll tax. This is really simple. It sounds complicated, but it's really simple. Because white people in the South did not want black people to vote, when black people showed up to cast a vote for president, the white people that were taking their vote said, well, you have to pay a tax first, and that tax is $100. And the black voter didn't have the money for that, and so they would go away. And white people were not charged this poll tax. Well, they were, but they weren't really enforced. They would let them go vote anyway if they couldn't pay. And so black people were prevented from voting by using a poll tax and also a literacy test. If you can't read, you can't vote. But the 24th Amendment, the 24th change to the Constitution, changes that. It ends it. And after the 24th Amendment, no more poll taxes. That was in 1964, in January. In July of 1964, looking at the next slide, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, also a big deal. This bars discrimination in hotels. You can't discriminate between blacks and whites in hotels, in restaurants, and if any place that's in public that does any kind of commercial trade. If you buy and sell things, you cannot discriminate based on somebody's black, or if they're Asian, or if they're Latino, or if they're anything. You cannot discriminate. Public facilities, meaning drinking fountains and bathrooms, cannot be segregated. Now you have to have one drinking fountain and one bathroom. Very important. And any agency, any government agency that, if they're going to receive government monies, they can't discriminate. And it also authorized the Attorney General, means the president's highest lawyer, to sue any schools who refuse to segregate. Refuse to desegregate, to integrate blacks and whites together. Some schools in West Virginia and Virginia decided they didn't want to integrate, and so they just closed school. They just closed the schools down for quite a while, because they just did not want to have blacks and whites going to school together. And that's how racist people were in the South during that period. Fast forward almost a year, August of 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act, and also a very important moment in American history. And now this specifies exactly what was permitted and not permitted in voting practices. Southern states had to get pre-clearance, meaning they had to get permission to change the voting law. They could not, because they were racist, they could not figure out a way to make sure that the blacks couldn't vote. So they had to get permission from the federal government before they could pass any new laws with voting. And it also addressed grievances by language in minority groups. It addresses vote dilution through gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is something that we're going to talk about in government, but basically it means you draw a line to make sure that you weaken how people vote. Now, that's a really complicated process to explain, but we're going to do it in government. And I want you to think here, just to know here, that gerrymandering is not permitted after the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Still happens, but it's not supposed to. It also bars tests, literacy tests, and devices in federal elections. It allows the Attorney General to bring suit against states that make people take literacy tests and pay poll taxes. So this is a really difficult time, and whites, especially in the South, do not like what's happening. And in 1964, remember that blue South we saw? Well, Lyndon Johnson is a Democrat. Remember those maps that we see where part of it is red and the South is always blue? Well, as a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson is blue, but the blue states are racist, and the blue states don't like black people, and the blue states don't want to integrate. They want separate schools. But Lyndon Johnson wants to have schools go black and white together. So in 1964, when he passes all these major laws to make sure that blacks and whites can be together, the South, in one election in 1964, turns red. And we'll see a map of that right here. So you can have a look at that map, and you can see that the South is now red. So look at the next slide, and then we see Martin Luther King Jr., and we don't see Martin Luther King Jr. You can't see him very well because he's laying on the ground, and you can see three men pointing, and they're pointing to somewhere where gunfire came from. The gunfire shot Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was assassinated, and this is in 1968. A very sad day for Americans. Again, we see this picture of Martin Luther King waving to the people, and he is an American hero, and it's a very sad day. Lyndon Johnson. In this next slide, we see Lyndon Johnson, and his campaign slogan is against his opponent in 1964. In your guts, you know he's nuts. He means he's crazy. Lyndon Johnson is from Texas. He's a Democrat. He's Baptist. It means he's Protestant, and he loses the South for the first time. And so the counterculture movement, I want to talk about this for a little bit because this is part of civil rights, kind of. When we talk about civil rights, really what we're talking about is the struggle for African Americans in the United States. But the counterculture movement we also call the hippie movement. And so this goes from protesting against civil rights and protests in Vietnam, and we talk a little bit more about that in the next lesson, but also to resisting. And so in 1964, we get what's called the Freedom Summer. And so we have white people from the northern states, New York was one of them, and we have college students, white college students from the north that come down to Mississippi, and they help register black people to vote. Because Southern whites aren't going to go out knocking on people's doors and say, hey, would you register to vote? So people from New York come down and help black people register to vote. It's called Mississippi Freedom Summer. Students from UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And this is a big deal, the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And people are killed during this Freedom Summer. But this is part of the counterculture. And college students in the United States are resisting the old things. They're resisting racism. They're resisting the Vietnam War. They're resisting their parents' ideas. And one of the ways that they do that is through music. If we see the next slide, we can see 1969, Woodstock. We have 3 Days of Peace and music. Some big names in music. Some of these you may recognize and some of them you may not. Most of these bands and musicians are now either retired or have died. But Santana, the Grateful Dead, CCR, Janis Joplin, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Joe Cocker, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Some of those people are dead and some of them are not dead. Some of them still occasionally will make music and go on tours and play concerts. And then we look at the next slide, and these are the kinds of people with their hands in the air and they're, what are they? Are they doing drugs? Are they all having sex and they're not married? Is it, and this is what their parents are asking. They're doing things that the parents don't approve of. And so the parents look at these people and they see these pictures and they're really, really concerned and they're really, really worried. And today we ask this question, what does this counterculture movement actually achieve? What does it do? What is free love and drugs and rock and roll? What is this disrespect for authorities and disrespect for the government? What does it achieve? It tears down family values, encourages drug use, and so those are bad things. But in the United States and in China, we have a long tradition of young people, students, protesting and changing things. You think of the 1919, the May 4 movement in 1919 as one of those. Brings a lot of really good change. You think of young people involvement in the Chinese Civil War in 1946 to 49. Brings a lot of really good change. And we see the same thing in the United States during the 1960s and early 1970s. Some of the change they brought was good, and some of the change they brought wasn't. But what they were really protesting against was too much government power and corruption. They wanted to bring more power to the people. And so that's part of what the counterculture movement did. And one of the things, we can see this on the next slide, one of the things that they do is try to bring more equality to women. And this is something that China had had for a long time before the United States, but they wanted to make sure that women had some equality. And by 1973, women could have access to abortion or to birth control for the first time because of some 3 cases that the Supreme Court decided. Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, Eisenstadt v. Baird in 1972, and Roe v. Wade in 1973. And those are court cases that really you should look up, and you might see them on a test or a quiz. Very important court cases in American history. And we're not going to go into detail on them here, but Very important. And so do some research and be ready for those on your test, and be ready to talk about those in a focus question or discussion question. So, all right, we'll see you next time for the next lesson. All right, have a good afternoon, guys. Bye-bye.